und wir fangen an, indem jetzt das zweite Panel mit dem Titel Restitution, Klammer auf, von Wissen, Klammer zu, stattfindet, moderiert durch Mikaél Assilkinga, den Sie schon heute Morgen in seiner Eigenschaft als Mitglied des Forscherteams der Uni Dschang und der TU Berlin kennengelernt haben. Mikaél, the floor is yours und ich freue mich.
So, thank you so much, Benedict. We will continue in English as you have seen it in the program. Yeah, thank you. I would like just to invite my guests already to sit in front of the public before introducing them. And I welcome you to this panel that is dedicated to the topic of terminology or the restitution of knowledge. Just as a reminder, in the first panel we spoke about the practical and theoretical tools that can be used to construct the often violent journey of cultural entities, the so-called museum objects from Cameroon to Germany. And this panel is planned as a continuity of the first one, and we would like to discuss with you the question in whose language or languages can the history of the spoliation be written, and which words can the perspective of the dispossessed be conveyed. I have the pleasure and the privilege to have as guests 3 colleagues, and I would like to introduce first Yann LeGall, who you have seen already this morning. Yann LeGall is a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute for Art History at the TU Berlin as part of the German Research Foundation project, the Restitution of Knowledge. In partnership with the University of Oxford and the Pitt Rivers Museum, he investigates plunder and events of colonial spoliation during so-called punitive expedition in German colonial contexts. His PhD thesis entitled Remembering the Dismembered, African Human Remains and Memory, Cultures in Repatriation, examined multidirectional and transnational memory of colonial violence around the return of ancestral remains to African countries and communities. He is also a member of the organization Berlin Postcolonial and the initiative Postcolonial Potsdam, with whom he leads critical tours on colonial traces in the Sanssouci Park. Yann LeGall, you are the most welcome in our panel. And we will just welcome you. The second guest, I think he will have the floor to introduce himself. But we have a lady who is joining us from the University of Princeton in the United States. She is Tiako, Djomatchoua, Murielle, Sandra, a PhD student in French and Francophone studies at the University of Princeton, like I said. Born and raised in a traditional Cameroonian community, her worldview is shaped by oral traditions and cultural expressions. These influences inform her scholarly interests and research activities. Her publications and communication address African-centered approaches to the fantastic, to care, to Geocentrism, to the post-colonial condition, to women and labor in the diaspora, and to sport and migration. Currently, Tiako Djomatchoua Murielle is completing a doctoral research that focuses on, important, decolonizing approaches to cataloging Francophone African material cultures and cultural heritage at Universal Museum. You're welcome. So we just invite Yann, who has also prepared a PowerPoint presentation for the starting of our discussion.
Thank you, Mikaél. It wasn't really planned that I speak twice during this conference, but now I have to do it. My talk will not really be about in which language should the history of dispossession and colonialism be written, because I think this is not a question that I am able to answer alone. My talk will rather be about how our project called the Restitution of Knowledge has conceived this kind of work of sharing the findings that we had in our research project, and everything that is kind of hidden, the kind of work that is hidden, and how it has been influenced also by activist practice. So you already saw that that blackboard, which is also in front of over there, and you saw that it's not only Cameroon, but it also includes expeditions in German Togoland, so in today's Togo and eastern Ghana. And the thing is that we started with German Togoland because it was called a so-called model colony, and so colonial propaganda was so successful in hiding the scale of violence that took place over there. And we thought that this should be a good first case or region to look at. But the thing is that all German Togoland and German Cameroon are very much linked to each other. Some colonialists and plunderers that were in Togo were then sent to Cameroon. We have the case three of them, for example. And while working on German Togoland, we tried to map some of those colonialists. Here is Gaston Thierry, who was actually killed in today's Nigeria in 1904, so in the former colony of German Cameroon, and how his collections are scattered all over the world. And this also kind of answers Felicity's question this morning of how to map them. And you see the Field Museum in Chicago has a collection by Gaston Thierry. And beside this kind of macro historical perspective, we wanted to focus on several expeditions that were kind of exemplary of this colonial violence and the plunder of possessions. And we looked at the 1896 expedition against the Kingdom of Dagbon in today's Ghana. And we've worked in close collaboration with Oeniko Mawuset-Tofa at the museum in Leipzig, and with now Michael Guima and Ricardo Rivoire, who also works on belongings that were plundered during this expedition. And the thing is that while working on this case, we asked ourselves, okay, we don't want to recenter those imperialists and those colonialists. How can we do that? How can we tell this history of dispossession from another perspective? And so in the study done by Emmanuel Tamakloe on oral history on that expedition, we found the quote, and I thank Elias also for working with this case, that the former ruler of Dagbon said, if the whites came from the sea, then they would merely be fish. And it started a whole discussion of how to tell this history. Do we say colonialists? Do we say, do we use the word colonialists? Do we use the word collectors? Or perhaps do we conceive them as fish? And this became the story of looting fish. This is my way of hacking the colonial archive. I think we should actually hack the colonial archive and kind of like also question those portraits and those photographies. And the thing is that this change of perspective is very much influenced by the work of Nyakasu Rumboro and Joshua Kwesi Aikins, who have always advocated, in Berlin especially, for a change of perspective in street names. So I live at the corner of Togo Straße and Kameruner Straße, and today there are 3 streets, no, not just 2 only, that were renamed from a colonialist to the name of an anti-colonial leader or the name of a movement of resistance, such as the Maji-Maji War. And this has very much influenced also our practice, our academic practice in telling those histories. Then we also asked ourselves, okay, what do we do with, say, silenced heritage? And while quoting the colonial archive, I thought about like thought about the power of this voice and the power of those quotes, and how it should be undermined by another voice and another perhaps intervention. And so I use quite a lot of sound also in my practice. And I hope we can hear this. Oh no. Okay, we cannot hear it. Basically, the soundtrack that from Gaiwar and Ganaba, a Ghanaian musician and jazzman, he's got a album that is called Africa Speaks, and I use that that album so to have a soundtrack that is behind the voice when I quote the colonial archive, but I cannot redo that now. But this is one of those questions of which language, and perhaps the language of drums is also a language. These are the belongings of another, not Yana Andani, but another Togolese ruler in the north of Togo, whose name is Biema Asabye. And these belongings have been scattered between Stuttgart, Leipzig, and Berlin. And we wanted to bring them together and tell the story from Biema Asabye's perspective. And we shared this history, or everything that we found in the archives, with Togolese researchers as we went through the process. So I wrote a lot of emails to Kokua Zamede, whom lots of you know, to Oinikoma Osetofa, to kind of inform them on the process of research. Finally, the last kind of activist practice that really influences my work is this transparency. And I started working on this plunder and dispossession as an activist in the campaign of Humboldt 21, when Nyakasuru Mboro, Christian Kopp, and I drew a list of every trace that we could find on ancestral remains in Berlin, and then we published this list in 2017, and this is what we would like to do as well with this list of so-called punitive expeditions. And this is what you find on the repository of the TU, and not in the book, but this is the raw material that you can use. And there are, there are 180 expeditions over there, linked to museums and sometimes to inventory lists. And there are a lot of quotes that kind of cement this, that kind of show the violence that you can find in the archives. So the problem with these quotes is that you need a trigger warning before, and this is what we also do very often in our practice. And so before diving into this list of expeditions, I would really recommend there's a tutorial next to it on how to use this archive. There's a version in English, another one in German, and another one in French. And this is also we try to work with 3 languages. These are colonial languages, but these are the languages that we use as an entry point. That's it. The last thing is that we also went, Elias and I, to Accra, to Lomé and Kara, and we took all our data on plunder in German Togoland on USB sticks, and we actually went to scholars and artists that we were in contact with, and we just gave them the data. And after that, we stay in contact with them, and they can always ask us, oh, by the way, what is this document, etc. And we hope that this collaboration will continue in the future. Thank you very much. That was 8 minutes, but yeah. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Yann. As we noticed, you are focused on Cameroon and Togo because 2 of them were also German colonies, and they share so many features. You speak of the so-called punitive expedition, a compound we will maybe discuss later on. You speak of the power of voices, but also activism. Those are interesting things, and maybe if you like, you can also come back to the history of Kameruns here in Berlin, because so many people think sometimes it is like to celebrate the former colonies, So Yann will certainly share his opinion about those Togo-Straße and Kamerun-Straße. Actually, I would like to invite our second guest, Murielle. Murielle, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, everyone. So today we are talking about the future of Cameroonian holdings in German museum. But while we are thinking about the future in the present, I think the museum is still thinking about the past, and the past in the sense of a past perfect and a past perfect continuous. So the future really lies in the question of naming, and my presentation is about unpacking the colonial gaze in cataloging African material cultures at universal museums, and the question of naming as profanation. So there is this general knowledge of the Universal Museum from the perspective of the people who signed the declaration on the importance, I want to highlight that word, on the importance and value of universal museums. And the public museums in Berlin, the museums in national museums in Berlin are one of the institutions who signed this declaration. And you know, in the declaration of the Universal Museum, there is this part that I really like to quote is the fact that objects, they think of the question of the object as belonging to the museum. So calls to repatriate objects that have belonged to museum collections for many years have become an important issue for museums and an important issue for us. So although each case has to be judged individually, that is how they put it, we should acknowledge that museums serve not just the citizen of one nation, but the people of every nation. And the question of the museums as the universal museums as a place where profanation is being enhanced is really connected to how objects are classified in the museum. And here, I think of some conventions like the Getty Foundation cataloging guidelines, and we have those texts as reference texts at ICOM, where they give you guidelines on how to catalog the object, how to preserve the object, and how to build controlled vocabularies. And all these elements, or all these guide or recommendations are very representative of the Western words and view of how material culture should be represented or how material culture should be perceived. And the question of control vocabularies and cataloging practices reflecting this idea of the material culture in our museums, and also the way we should think about naming the object kind of bears what I consider the colonial gaze. And to unpack that colonial gaze, we need to think about the legitimacy of the creators of art information. We need to think about the notion of controlled vocabulary itself, and also the approaches to taxonomies and terminologies. So by controlled vocabularies, what I understand is, what the Getty Foundation understand, is the fact that it gives you like some formalized ways of finding and tracking objects within the collection. And now, you know, with the COVID, there have been like a direct move to the digital, where every information is trying to be made accessible, but is it actually accessible? So these control vocabularies is usually formed from the lexical, So the control vocabulary is built on the grammars and the way the lexical relations are built. So for an object, if you enter a word that seems similar to another one, and this is the reproduction of the colonial gaze. So the control vocabulary gives you synonyms and antonyms as entries to find and locate an object. So how synonymous are some of our African objects is kind of problematic, as when we know and we think of the African object as a unique piece that represent people identity, people history, and people traditions. So I give you an example which is not from a German museum, but another kind of universal museum. And this is from the Smithsonian collection, where you have some object like this that have makers as the name of the people who build the object, Luba artist. And they will show and describe the object as being made of wood, just wood. So there is no distinction in terms of what kind of wood is being used, which usually in our communities gives you an idea of whether that object is sacred, or if that object is domestic, or if that object is just profane object. So with these practices, that are also reproduced in many German museums, and LeGall shows us some entries in his presentation, we understand how diffused the idea of the universal museum is in terms of the practices, but also in terms of the traditions at our Western museum. And this implication is, in terms of recommendation, could be the idea of thinking of the creators of art information, not from the perspective of the individual artist, but because where does the artist come from? I believe every artist comes from a community, has some influences, defend a worldview. So if we think of the legitimacy of creators of art information in museums, we should remove ourselves from the pitfalls of the artist as an individual, but the artist as a community, especially when it comes to African material culture. And then the danger in this process is the fact that the creators of art information, when it comes to naming, are mostly institutionalized. So who has the legitimacy of naming an object in the museum? Definitely the curators. Why not the art historian and the ethnologist? And every scientific, everybody who has a scientific legitimation. But what do you do of our community of origins? What knowledge do they have of the object that you, I don't want to say looted, stolen? So in this situation, we really need to rethink of the creators of art information in our different museums. And then, when it comes to the question of cataloging African objects at the Universal Museum, there is a danger of misnaming. And I took the case of the Smithsonian National Museum of African Arts, where we can see that the names are represented without taking into consideration the worldview. And I really want to think of the name as the language of the object. So when we see an object that is presented as Luba, full stop, we miss the identity of the object, we miss the social life of the object, we miss the biography of the object, we also miss the memory of the object. So all by misnaming, this information are lost. They are either silenced or hidden, but definitely lost for the community, especially when we think of repatriation. What object goes to whom, and how do those community or targeted community get to know the object, which is a very complex information. And the question of misnaming also leads to the problem of profanation, because in our museum, be it in the way information are presented or the way the information are being exhibited, we don't have a distinction between what object is sacred, what object is profane. And in this case, the conservation, the classification, and the exhibition of the object are different means through which profanation is being achieved at our cultural institution. And now, why do I come back to the idea of profanation? Is because the African worldview in general, and Cameroonian worldview in particular, is defined by a form of cosmic totality, which means the coexistence of the visible and the invisible in our daily activity, in our let's say DNA. So when we think of Cameroonian holding at Universal Museum, without paying attention to those very important information, we kind of are not trying to avoid the danger of profanation, but actually reproducing profanation. And the outcome of my research, hopefully, or the different expected outcome could be rethinking the naming process by taking into consideration traditional onomastic and ontology of the object. This could be achieved by a form of co-creation of knowledge at the museum, by opening the museum to the community, by also acknowledging without institutionalizing the knowledge of that community have of the object. Because the danger of institutionalizing too the knowledge of the object could be creating another science of African object, which is not actually the goal, but could be. But we try to avoid these politicized approaches to cultural heritage as much as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Murielle, for this interesting input. You speak of controlling people or controlling things just through vocabulary and terminology, and shows us how misnaming things lead to a profanation. That's a very interesting point. We'll be back to that. And actually, we would like to invite Fogha to the chair. And like I said, he will introduce himself and then continue with his talk. Fogha, you have the floor.
Thank you. Refem. Mshati Wija. I'm not sure what I am doing here. And as you would see, I was not introduced as the others. The problem with that was, one, a very technical one, that I had written a long biography, and I had said, I am a PhD student at the DFG-funded program at TG Minor Cosmopolitanisms Research. I have a master's degree in sociology. I have a master's degree in social work. I studied sociology, international relations. I was banned from the Humboldt Forum, blah, blah. All what this does is to ask you to respect me, not the person, but the institutional backing that I have. I thought about it last night, and I sent Mikaél a message, and I said, oh, I changed my bio. I would like to be introduced as a clown and a troublemaker who should not be taken seriously. Mikaél was unable to do it for obvious reasons. Very respectful. But this, in fact, is the very point of language for me. You give a dog a bad name, and you kill it. Before I start blabbing, and what I will do is blabbing, in fact, because if I would describe the situation in the museums and colonization and all of this, I would use a certain word that I would not use here because, again, language is not only governed by vocabulary, but by ideas of public decorum. I would have used a word that starts with F, ends with a K, and if conjugated in the past tense, you add an ED behind it. But public decorum, language is governed. I will not use that word. Instead, I will go around and try to approximate the feeling, the meaning, and the sense that that word would have had with a long-winded discussion. But before I do that, I think I have just maybe 2 minutes now. I'll ask for a few moments of silence for the people that have been killed in the colonial military expeditions. That is the point of language. Sometimes we speak not because we really have something to say, but because we are uncomfortable with the situation and we keep winding and talking. And this, for me, is the point. So I want to share with you 3 considerations on language used within the museum and within colonization and around the topics we've been discussing today. When I was invited to write a chapter for the project, I saw an atlas of absence, and I thought, absence always engenders presence. And I wouldn't necessarily describe So or Cameroon as a place where things are absent. People have figured out ways of talking about these things. I also thought that absence can misconstrue a lot of things. For one, it frames us, communities, as people who are needy, who want everything that has been stolen from them. But instead of talking about what we want, because it's present in Germany, I'd like to share with you what we don't want. We don't want colonial restituted objects that come as benevolent gifts. We don't want any of that if it doesn't come with an accompanying, and not just linguistic apology, but heartfelt apology. We do not want restituted objects if they come poisoned. And we have to discuss the toxic entanglements. Lotte Aron's work does this a lot, with working with toxicity in the museum. We're not begging, we're demanding. And I'll step on some toes. If the shoe fits, please wear it. The second consideration I would like to share with you is, in fact, the manufacturing of absence by using language, mislabeling, we would like to call it. When I was helping Boro yesterday, who uses his phone in German, he asked me, can you put it in silence so that it doesn't ring in the middle of the conference? I tried to put it to silence, and I saw that the silence mode on the phone was named lautlos. Loudless, liberally translated. German believes that when it translates something from another language to German, it is übersetzen, sitting it on top, the pedestal of Germany, of German comprehension. So I do an untersetzen now, a loudless. Now, if one considers lautlos, loudless, it means that silence, in fact, in these cases and around these issues is not a natural condition. It is a condition that has been engineered. For one thing, the experience of colonial looting and salt was extremely loud. The cannons were loud. People cried really loud. The guns were very loud. And even when it was loudlos, when there was no more cannon shooting, subjugation had happened. And the war doesn't end when the guns stop. The suffering doesn't end when the guns are no longer loud. That suffering goes on today in the form of museum exhibitions, which brings me to my third point. Colonial expeditions. This is what we're talking about today. I look at museum exhibitions also as the continuation of colonial punitive expeditions. So I think also Yann would, might, should, could agree that the exhibitions in museums are punitive exhibitions. Punitive not only in the sense that museums are conceived of as prisons where access is not an inert thing, but where access must be granted to humans who have, again, an idea of public decorum. If not, I wouldn't have been banned from the Humboldt Forum. Punitive exhibitions. Punitive in the sense that, like Murielle would say, the naming of those things in museums, those subjects, objects, agencies, as we would like to call them, again, a move to language, the naming of those things profane them. So I share a personal anecdote. When I showed a picture of Ngonso to the fun of So, and I said, look, it was named a kola nut basket. He told me, Boyo Revirima. And now I have to translate the use of language, an imposed colonial strategy. It has to be intelligible. If I said my name is Fogha, somebody asked me, what does it mean? If I said my name is John, John, nice to meet you. John does not need explanation. But I explain what Boyo Revirima means. It means, isn't this witchcraft? Witchcraft in the sense that to do witchcraft is not to just kill somebody. In fact, The worst kind of witchcraft is to let someone suffer a life. If you beat a dog, you can be repentant. If you give it a bad name, you've marked it for death. If you kongonso a kola nut basket, it is not only profane to the insult person, it is unrecognizable. So instead of talking to you about agencies and why they're agencies because they have a soul and a spirit, this is a coffee mug. And I think this also answers the question of what is going on in Cameroon with regards to restitution. This is a coffee mug. This is a pen. Now, if I put both things into relation, the cup has started gaining some kind of agency. It's producing a sound. Now, if I hit this rhythmically and I sing, "Oh, Jamansa Kengele, oh," this is one of the songs that people sing and so to remember colonization. In fact, within it, it's engendered a demand for restitution. Now, the argument about the agency of the cup or about the agency of the subjects is not just that agency is inherent within them. The agency is relational. I hit it with the pen. My voice accompanies it, a certain rhythm, sound, meaning, names. Agency is relational. We cannot argue, therefore, that these objects have agency within European museums if they are not put back in the relations that engender that agency. This doesn't mean they have no agency here, of course. They do, but the agency is, for the most part, toxic. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Fogha, for your introductory remarks. And before we jump in the discussion, I would just like to highlight that I have not the intention to hurt someone in my panel, but I've chosen intentionally not to introduce you as you asked me because I was really feeling uncomfortable with this word. And I have to, so I decided, we discussed with Benedict already, but that's my decision. And I think it's better if you choose to use those words that you by yourself use them. And I think it's clear like this for anyone, but it was not my intention to present or introduce Yann and Murielle and not to introduce you. So yeah, thank you so much for your talk, and then we will open the discussion towards the end. But first of all, I would like to ask a question to Yann, who has shown and shared many information since this morning about expeditions that they called punitive. And let it be in Togo or in Cameroon, there have been so many chiefs that expressed their disagreement with the Germans, and then the Germans have organized the so-called punitive expedition to take away their objects or their symbols of power. And then you have also explained how there is a kind of discrepancy between the official reports and what we used to see in the archives. So first of all, Yann, thank you for all those informations. I would like to speak about the words punitive. Why are they called punitive? And the intention behind, if probably you could say something about that.
Thanks, Mikaél. So we did a kind of like historical semantic study of the words so-called punitive expeditions, or in German Strafexpedition. The words was born in the colonial era. The first recorded text that used the German compound was in 1808, the first text that we could find on a report on the colonial expedition. You see? Yeah. I just said colonial exhibition. On a colonial expedition in the south of Borneo in 1775. So it was a report later on this expedition where the French actually mutilated local people, plundered their belongings, murdered the local ruler. For the English compound, there are some a historian called Chris Ballard wrote that the first encounter of the word that he could find was in 1869 on reports of colonial wars in today's Pakistan, so the British attacking Sikh rulers and stealing their land. So this word was born in an era of colonial violence. And why? Because, as I said this morning, it has been used as a kind of rhetorics to put the blame on local communities for the violence that is exerted against them, for plundering their possessions, but not only for killing their people, also taking civilians as prisoners and sending them to forced labor camps, raping the women. And this is something that should be underlined, because this is something that is actually seldom found in colonial archives and that has been silenced, but also for stealing their land. And this is also something that in South Africa, for example, in Namibia, is very, very central to reworking this colonial history.
So actually, if you say colonial expedition, what will be the difference with a punitive expedition?
Okay, there are many types of different compounds that were added to expedition. So the word expedition is a word that is a military word. Expedite in Latin means dispatching troops. And then afterwards, when say the so-called discoverers, these European ships were sent to map the land and steal the land, then new types of adjectives started popping up, like scientific expedition, like geographic expedition, ethnographic expedition. But the thing is that most of those expeditions were almost all of them were accompanied by colonial troops, or actually relied on military structures to be able to collect, so to say, or map the land. So, but we focus rather on the expeditions that were led by the colonial military. We didn't really. It would have, like, the scope would have been a bit too much had we focused on so-called ethnographic expeditions led by, say, Frobenius, for example.
Okay, thank you so much. We are struggling with that compound, and everything is also a question of perspective. Murielle, you have spoken about profanation that takes place from the way people name things. I don't know to which extent you integrate into your research oral history, for instance, but towards the end of your presentation, you said we have to consider also the communities. So is there any process we can rehabilitate things by also considering names proposed by communities, or what do you think about that point?
So thank you so much for the question. The question of the participation of community is something very important in terms of restituting the identity of the object, but the process in terms of how do we put the museum in conversation of the community is a very delicate one, because with the presentation that happens in the other panels, there was this idea of the existing colonized religious practices that have been already internalized by the community. You showed an object from a museum to the target community, and they tell you, this is witchcraft. We are Christians. So there is a problem on the ground. The problem is not just identifying the community, the target community, as you do with provenance studies, but it's also making the community acknowledge the material culture that the museum has. And that collaboration could also be achieved if the museum, acknowledge all the knowledge that the community have of the object. So what I mean by this is that this acknowledgement should not be institutionalized, because there is always this danger of institutionalizing in the museum. And that's why you have the information about one same object scattered through different departments. You have one object whose information will be found in the anthropology department, in the ethnomusicologist department, and this makes it difficult to understand what what the object is without even just going back to the community. There is a preliminary work that needs to be done in the museum in terms of reuniting the specialized, institutionalized knowledge about objects. And now, once the provenance studies that you do helps to map that cultural geographies of objects, and then you can identify the target community. There needs to be a sensibilization about that cultural heritage. And not all communities actually are Christianized or are Muslim or forgot about their heritage here, because this is a whole process of alienation that is rooted in the colonial kind of religious heritage. So all this work is not a work that is linear, but needs to be thought from an Afrocentric perspective with all the elements on the ground to make that heritage accessible.
Thank you so much. And we have also learned through your presentation how objects are classified in the museum, because the museum itself has its own terminology and a classification methodology, because normally they don't take the objects from any museum, especially for those looted. They have taken them from palaces, in the houses of dignitaries. But once in the museum, there is a kind of need to classify them and then to generate a sort of knowledge. All that is about terminology. But I turn now to Fogha. My question will be, is there any power that is more powerful than words? You have spoken about silence. Are there things that we need just to express through silence and not through words? The question is difficult, I agree, but do you think the terminology we used, we see how it is not easy? Murielle thinks when we use these words, it profanates the object, and also the words punitive, like Yann explained, is not that so much neutral. So at the end, do we really need to express things through those words?
I actually answered your question already. When I sighed, that was an answer. But the trouble with this is that sighing is not necessarily considered powerful by itself, except I were to say, I am sighing because of. That was it. It's an acknowledgement that the question is difficult. It's also an acknowledgement that I don't know. I will not pretend to know. It says too many things. And all of those things are only based on relation. Words by themselves mean nothing. Anecdote. I talked with someone in Cameroon when I went to do research, and I said, can we meet tomorrow at 4 p.m.? He said, yes, come by my office tomorrow at 4 p.m. I'm a man of my word. I went by the office at 4 p.m. and he says, oh, you're here. I said, yeah, we agreed tomorrow, yesterday that we meet today. And he says, you know, when I said I'm a man of my words, what I meant was that I have words, I say them. They're not binding. This is what it means to be a man of my words, to be able to have words and use them. Now, do we say words are powerful or language is powerful in this regard? Relations, relational. If I sat here and I said, Adubeya Jingi, and you didn't understand me, however loudly I say it, relational, you wouldn't understand it. The power is diluted. The point of language, therefore, is in fact that it puts people in relation, and that language can only be interpreted through those relations. So, again, if words are powerful by themselves, I wouldn't say so. But if they are powerful when put in relation with other things, and this is exactly what I am arguing for, a relationality, not relativity, relationality, to constantly be negotiating what it means to be here and there and this. So if somebody said, where are you from? I would say, I'm from Cameroon. But what does that really mean? Katrina knows some paper I wrote for the Natural Museum where my argument was, I am not a Proun. I'm not a Proun. But I had to write 10 pages to explain why. Because when the Portuguese came to the coast of Cameroon, they said, so many Prouns in the River Wuri. Let us call this area Rio dos Cameros, River of Prouns. The Germans come and say Rio dos Cameros is too long, let's call it Cameroon, and the British say Cameroon, and the French say Cameroon. Cameroon is a Proun. Do I look like a Proun to you? I cannot survive underwater. Rio dos Cameros, I am Cameroonian. The relationality again. And this for me is, in fact, why restitution is important, because once all of these things are put in relation, the whole idea of what we have as Cameroon has to be in itself a negotiation. It is not an innate identity, it is one that is constantly being negotiated. Nothing is a given. The power of words is useless if I spoke to you in English and you couldn't understand me.
Thank you so much. I think we are going towards the end of our time, but before that, and I will just let you know that we will give you the floor just after the next panel, because we are gathering all the questions for the final discussion, so don't wonder if I don't open the discussion with the public. Sorry for that, but you will have the opportunity to ask your questions afterwards. Thank you so much for that. Yann, yesterday we have seen the colleagues of Berlin post-colonial. Sorry, Berlin decolonial. And then you, as member of that group, or as group, you work a lot on the question of terminology, but as you said, you are living in the Afrikanische Viertel, and I promise to come back to that point, Kamerunstraße, Berlinstraße, Togo Straße, please. When we see all those names in Berlin, what does that mean for somebody who may be in the city for the first time?
I'm looking for someone who could better answer that question. Someone who has participated in a campaign. Marianne? Because the thing is, I learned everything on this kind of change of perspective from people that were hurt by those street names and wanted to change something. And so I don't feel I am the right person to answer that question.
Eginlaye. 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 Es war einmal, so fängt es an mit einem Märchen normalerweise. Aber wir haben eine andere Art und Weise, Erzählungen anzufangen. Und das erste ist Perspektivwechseln. Ein paar Menschen kamen aus weit weg und haben gesehen, oh, es gibt da Krabben. Und die haben den Namen Kameruns gegeben. Aber wir wussten, es sind keine Krabben, es sind Beatoi. Das heißt, sie kommen einmal im Jahr, einmal jede 2 Jahre, um das Land unserer Ahnen zu segnen. Deswegen ist es notwendig, zu umbenennen. Tinana Bebolo, das ist das, was wir sagen. Du gibst einen Namen, du bestimmst ein Schicksal. Deswegen ist es so wichtig, zu umbenennen. Aber dafür müssen wir zu Françoise Ndoumé, zu Tete Prince Komadumbe, zu den Ahnen, zu unseren Ältesten, zum Boro, der irgendwo da ist, um zu sehen, was nicht im Handy ist, was nirgendwo, nur durch Erzählungen, durch das gesprochene Wort weitergegeben wird und ab und zu mal in Büchern geschrieben wird. Deswegen ist es so wichtig, zu umbenennen. Das ist die Antwort.
Thank you so much. I think we have our answer, Yann. Murielle, I'm looking to you. We are speaking in this panel about the restitution of knowledge, and we know how important it is still to work with archival documentations in the museum. But those archives are still problematic, like Sebastian explains it this morning. Could you give us, please, an example where you think knowledge is or could be inaccessible just because of the information that one's find in those archives? Because before restituting knowledge, they have to be known. And then if you have name that misleads, how do you manage that in your research? Maybe you have an example or something that you can consider to explain that point.
Yes, I think I have an experience I can share, but I hope the institution won't close the door to me next time I apply. But prior to coming here, I was at the African Museum in Tervuren, where I was doing my research on, just collecting data about the possibility of an African-centered approach to the question of material culture, principally from the fact that I was a little bit disgusted by how objects were put into categories, like the Luba object in general. And that's the main motivation to go to the African Museum, as I know they have a lot of Congolese arts, and dig into the archives to see what is available. So in the archive, by digging into the archives and reading from acquisition files and also from classification practices from the moment the museum was open, I understood that choosing to put the object in category, putting the object in category the way they do is a choice, because the name of some object, not all, are available in the archives. So it means the object could have been called the way the community actually called them, but they choose to call them appui-tête for the cariatide. They will call them gobelets for anything that has a hole in it. I mean, it is true. It is hilarious, but that is the truth. And they will call poupée some object that looks like a modern poupée. So I had to use those entry when you think of the accessibility of information. Those information are only accessible in the intranet of the institution, which means I need accreditation to be able to read those. I need to know how to find them, to have access to them. And I also need the support of the institution, because you can order things and you get something else. How can you know that it is not what you ordered? So all this is a synergy of action and collaboration that could help valorize what is already available while finding ways to connect with the target community in terms of co-creating knowledge about material cultures at the museum. So what I would say is, yes, encourage, because it's not a work that one person can do, but encourage interdisciplinarity, break boundaries, because in the research that we do, unfortunately, when you don't have the credentials of being a specialist in a specific domain, it is hard for you to be able to reconstitute what is scattered in the museum. And finding a solution to the scatteredness of knowledge in the museum by breaking this, let's say, supercherie of this specialized knowledge is also a way to restitute African knowledge from what is available. And then now move to the next step of co-creation of knowledge, restitution, and repatriation. Why not? Because I always say, why not? Because it is a process that has a lot of backlogs, because politics is already involved in the process. And once politics is there, you know there's a lot. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. I would just like to ask a last question to Fogha. We are speaking also about restitution. If we consider the case of Ngonso, for instance, the Ngonso is still in Germany, and we are speaking about the restitution of knowledge. If actually we consider also the repatriation or the restitution like a physical transfer of the Ngonso from Germany to Cameroon, what will that change also in the case or in the question of the restitution of knowledge? Will we be reaching the point of the co-creation of knowledge, or it doesn't matter whether the object is here in Germany or in Cameroon?
This is, in fact, I think the crux of my research and consideration, post-restitution representation, not just the representation of Ngonso, representation in the broadest sense, not just that Ngonso must be put in some museum or take some other form of this. And there have been several proposals to what should happen to Ngonso when Ngonso comes back. But let us think about physical transfer first. The question I would ask is, how did Ngonso find herself in So in the first place? We conceive of Ngonso as an object, or if we conceive of it as a deity or something. How did Ngonso find herself in So? It didn't fall from the sky. It is something that was created by the So people, for them, for very specific reasons. And in that relation, Ngonso also creates the So person in a certain way. And the question yesterday was, I go back to it, which was, what does it look like in an ideal world when these objects have been restituted? I use object here again because it is still an object in the colonial sense. And I advocate always for using subject, but I do not want to perform a linguistic decolonization or restitution of Ngonso when the political reality doesn't reflect that yet. Now, if we say, what is, in an ideal world, what would this look like? It would, in fact, in an ideal world, mean that So people do not need Ngonso. then Gonso would not exist. Because Gonso is a bridge between the world of the bodies and the world of ancestors, in the world of the spirits. So in an ideal world, there will not be any need for that bridge because these two worlds would intermingle. Now, have we not found different ways of doing that? In an ideal world, Jesus Christ would not have to come down and be hammered and then you have him on the wall. And this is the point. Ideal world. Now, why did Gonso people make Gonso? Is the question for me. There's been a proposal to bury Gonso once Gonso returns to Gonso. It's been done by Professor Godfrey Banyoitangwa Gobata, who argues for the burial of Gonso in the palace once Gonso comes back. Why would you bury it? Oh, the maggots would eat it. But if the maggots eat it, aren't they Gonso maggots? Let us keep it in a museum. Did you steal it from a museum? That's the question. What happened to the place you stole it from? Why must you impose this representation on the Nsot people? These are questions, in fact, that have not been answered yet. And this, for me, is the very question of we do not, in fact, need new narratives. People in Nsot are speaking always. Oh, Jaman sa kengele, akidrofia, oh, boy, we elena, akidrofia. They are singing, they are speaking, they are drumming. In the absence of drums, then so a person says, we dance to the sound of clinging machetes. If you don't have drums, you don't need to make new drums necessarily. No, use what you have, the machetes. So, in fact, we don't need new narratives. We need new ears. I go back to Godfrey Banyoitangwa again, who argues that Europe has such a loud mouth and such tiny ears that when it pretends to listen to other people, all it hears is an echo of itself. And this is the point. That loud mouth is the museum, the largesse of the museum. And when it pretends to listen to Nsot's representation of themselves, all they can see is the lack of a museum. No new narratives, new ears. And again, relationality, you know? If I say, oh, sekuntang rachilojako drakwa shiv yangri no wishi drakwa oh. If I say it here, it's nonsense, it's not understandable. If I sing it in a room, it's very different. No one is allowed, anyone that is not initiated is not allowed to see it. If I sing it on the road with a masquerade following me, it's a spectacle to watch. These different places where we are having these conversations also have a lot on the comprehension of these topics. And the question is not taking the discussion outside of the museum, but in fact, taking the museum's head outside of its navel. Stop the narcissistic navel gazing. Develop new ears. Thank you.
So, thank you so much. That will be the word of the end of this panel. And we have a coffee break. I don't know if Benedict has something to say, but if not, we will just jump upstairs to have a coffee, and then we are back according to the program to follow the next panel. Thank you so much for Fogha. Thank you to Yann. Thank you to Murielle. Thank you so much.